Hi there, today I'm going to be talking about Kiss of the Spider Woman by Manuel Puig. Originally published in 1976, I read the first vintage international edition, copyright 1991. Here's the book cover for that. And per the back of the novel, as a summary of the plot, in an Argentine prison, two men share a cell. Melina, a gay window dresser who is self-centered, self-denigrating, yet charming as well, and Valentin, an articulate, fiercely dogmatic revolutionary haunted by memories of a woman he left for the cause. Both are gradually transformed by their guarded but growing friendship and by Melina's obsession with the fantasy and romance of the movies. So that's kind of an initial plot and summary of the story. Before I delve deep into my thoughts, I want to talk about the writing style, which is a little bit difficult to follow. So it does say in the summary that Melina is obsessed with movies, and that's a major part of the storytelling. Is Melina and Valentin are, or essentially Melina is retelling some of his favorite movies to Valentin. He's describing them and in really great detail, the characters, how they look, how they act, the dialogue, the music, and going into really great detail. And I think one of the purposes of this tactic is as a way to help characterize both of the persons in the cell, how they react to the story, how they converse with each other while Melina is telling the story of the movie. Additionally, the story goes into really descriptive footnotes, which are meant to be psychoanalytic, addressing homosexuality, the cause of it, psychoanalysis of folks such as Freud, and some other psychologists with published studies regarding that subject as well. Additionally, when the two cellmates are having discussions, they are sometimes hard to follow. It's not really a traditional writing style. It almost reads like a play where there's a dash and it will have a sentence or two of text, and there's no real way to identify who's speaking outside of the characters saying each other's names pretty frequently. So that can also be a little bit difficult at times to understand, and sometimes you have to kind of reread things to understand who's saying what. Eventually, I think as you do get deeper into the story, you start to understand the two characters' personalities and kind of how they react to different situations better, so it is a little bit easier to differentiate who is speaking at a time. But all in all of these elements are fairly unusual in a novel. The next thing that I want to talk about is the characters themselves. So as we talked about, Melina and Valentin, two cellmates in Argentina. And this is where it gets a little bit confusing. The story is taking place around the rise of socialism, and Valentin is, by all accounts, a political prisoner and a socialist idealist. He is imprisoned for his public demonstrations and political action against the current state. Melina, on the other hand, is noted throughout the book as being a gay man, yet when Melina self-identifies, he states fervently that he is a woman. So while reading the story, it again is a little bit confusing. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to act under the assumption that Melina is actually a transgender woman, and at the time that the story was written in the mid-70s, there wasn't the language or knowledge to encapture this sentiment. Additionally, there's the fact that this story is actually a translation from the original Spanish language. So I'm also assuming that there's a potential of my misunderstanding from what the original text was meant to convey. So I've already given a brief summary of the plot of the story. To go a little bit deeper, essentially the story follows the growing relationship between these two cellmates, and initially they're pretty different in nearly every way. Melina self-identifies as not very politically oriented, whereas Valentin is imprisoned for his advocacy and beliefs in government and politics. They also come from fairly different backgrounds. Melina isn't described as being extremely poor, but one can assume that he isn't extremely well off. His mother's very sick, and Melina assumes throughout that she needs to get out to be able to take care of her mother. Whereas Valentin, we learn through internal monologue and conversation that he actually does come from a fairly well-off family and has some money and things that he essentially was willing to sacrifice for his beliefs. So there's really a lot of differences between the two in fairly fundamental ways in terms of their gender identity and sexuality, their backgrounds, uh, their various upbringings, the wealth disparity between the two, as well as their general interests in life. Melina is very into art and movies and the grandeur of it all, whereas Valentin is more, he cares a lot more about the character of the person and the values that they represent, as opposed to the purely aesthetic notions that Melina seems to be more focused on. So as they grow in conversations and we learn more about each character through their reactions in conversation and reactions through the stories that Melina is detailing, we also start to learn more about both characters, their past, their lives, why they're in here, what they stand for, and there are some twists and turns that take place. So now I want to talk about some of the aspects of the story that I really liked. I really found Melina's descriptions of the films that he saw and really liked to be really entertaining. Seemingly, she's describing films from the golden age of cinema and Hollywood. The descriptions that she has are really beautiful and thoughtful. She is a fantastic storyteller. I feel like she really takes you in to the story and gives you a full immersive experience of seeing the movie would actually be like. Additionally, I think that Puig's choice of taking two aspects of homosexuality and political social action are still classes of people that are discriminated against and unfairly treated and even brutalized by the government. I also like that the prison warden and guards are characterized as being kind of dumb. They have a lot of plots going that don't really ever play out according to their plan. They are kind of getting played, and they're characterized as essentially just being not very good people. They're not evil people, but they don't really have any sympathy from the reader. I think it's especially timely given the context of the story and the subject matter of prison and why these two people are imprisoned. And it kind of adds an extra layer of commentary that I think the author is trying to place upon the reader. Now, moving on to some of the aspects of the story I wasn't as much of a fan of. So, as we talked about earlier, the actual writing style of the story in itself is pretty confusing. Personally, I found essentially all of the footnotes that the author included regarding the psychoanalysis to be pretty irrelevant to the story. It didn't really add anything, given that I'm a current reader reading the story nearly 50 years after publication. It just seemed more dated, and it kind of dated the story, and I wasn't a fan. Initially, the general writing style can be pretty confusing. Even when the characters are discussing a film, the dialogue can shift into internal dialogue or dialogue between the two characters or dialogue in the film. And I think sometimes it works to the story's advantage of being ambiguous, and the film that's being described is actually a reference to the real life or the real feelings of the characters in the prison. However, I think that this could have been displayed a little bit more clearly to avoid some of the confusion where this point didn't work in the favor of the story, which I personally felt was for the majority of the time. Now we're going to talk about the modern interpretation of the writing style and the way that certain characters were portrayed in the story. So, from my understanding, Puig was a left leaning, potentially socialist homosexual who left Argentina and actually moved to Mexico for a good amount of his later years due to the fact that he was feeling ostracized in Argentina. So, I think that Puig himself is being portrayed through the characters of Melina and Valentin, respectively, and it's kind of a mix of who he is or maybe who he sees himself or wants to become. Also, I think maybe it's even a analogy for two sides of himself that he feels he needs to lock away or imprison, just as these two characters are imprisoned for exhibiting these traits in Argentine society. However, I personally found the depiction of Melina especially pretty troubling at times. Again, it's probably due to my modern reading of a text that has aged. However, I found the general character of Melina to be slightly problematic. The reason that she is imprisoned is due to, quote, corrupting a minor, which can only be referenced in my mind as acts of pedophilia. So the fact that we are depicting a transgender character as a pedophile in and of itself is really troubling. I think additionally, the actual characterization of Melina is almost as problematic. She is seen as overly sensitive, almost childlike in terms of how she reacts to situations emotionally. She seems very stunted in her emotional maturity and desperate for the affection of a man. There's a subplot of she is in love with a straight man on the outside world who clearly doesn't care about her, doesn't think about her, and it was very much a one-sided type of relationship. And yet she still goes out of her way to try to talk and be friends with this person. Without spoiling too much, Melina is duplicitous and is not being completely honest with Valentin. I'm not going to say about what, but there is a pretty big part of the story where Melina's dishonesty is involved. Overall, I personally just didn't really like the characterization. I felt it could have been more well-rounded and human, and it seemed to be more of a negative stereotype what society dictates as opposed to what Puig, the author, may have actually felt. I kind of go back and forth with myself on this point because I have to consider things like the time the piece was written and potentially, even though these are more negative elements, it's possible that the author was finding in himself the more negative stereotypes and portraying all of these negative stereotypes into this character intentionally as a way of trying to potentially purge the demons inside himself. Who's to really say? As a modern reader, it was difficult to digest certain elements of the story because of the depictions within. Overall, I thought that the story was interesting. I don't know that it's something I would necessarily recommend to people. And while I think the general themes of the story are timely, the depictions are extremely dated. I'm glad I read this story. I don't know if I'd revisit it, but I'm happy that I read it. If this is something that you've read or are interested in reading, I'd love to know your thoughts. Did you agree with me? Do you think I'm completely off base? I'd love to know. Thanks for watching.